expect some more people to join. Welcome once again to this session. This is the third session and the second day of our event. This session is on economic development and prosperity. So just to mention that if you're not speaking, please put yourself on mute. It would be also great if you could turn off your video if you're not speaking. I think that should save bandwidth for the presenters as well and allow us to focus on the presentations. My name is Emmy Chirchir. I'm a Science Tech Innovation Advisor working with the FCDO, the East Africa Research Innovation Hub based in Nairobi, Kenya, and I'm so glad to be your moderator today. The session will flow in this way. I will invite the presenters to, we have 4 presentations. I will invite the first 2 presenters, and then we will play a video from one of the beneficiaries talking about the uptake of one of the evidence pieces, and then we will have the two final presentations, and then I will invite a 5th panelist to speak about uptake once again, and then we will go to the discussions. But I just want to check if Eric, you're on the line, and whether you want to quickly come on as our discussant and just say good morning and introduce yourself before we go to the presentations.
Good morning. My name is Eric Olanya. I'm excited to be on this session and looking forward to the discussions later today. I'm the Country Director for the Department for International Trade at the British High Commission in Kampala. Thank you.
Emmy, you're on mute.
Sorry, yes, thank you, Eric. Please feel free to put your comments into the chat, put your questions into the chat. Let us also know what's next for research and evidence with regards to this session, if you have any ideas that you'd like to share. So I'll quickly move into the presentations. We'll start with the presentation on resolving the unresolved non-tariff barriers. So welcome, Maximiliano.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation, and congratulations to the EARF actually for completing 6 years of very good work. I am going to present these results of this project that we have conducted quite around 2016. And the result basically, the project was about trying to measure and eventually being able to assess what is the impact of removing non-tariff barriers in the trade within East Africa, with the aim that this evidence will facilitate their resolution. If we can go to the next slide. Basically, just to provide a bit of background, the East African community is the most integrated regional economic community in Africa, with a customs union that was established in 2005 and tariff eliminated across the region in 2010. However, even this achievement, I mean, the intra-regional trade remains quite low. And although the infrastructure have improved, one of the issues that is still there are the non-tariff barriers. As the word suggests, non-tariff barriers could be absolutely anything except of a tariff. The EAC started a program to eliminate NTBs, and this basically is based on bottom-up mechanisms to report NTBs to the respective authorities, where actually all the region come together and try to work the way to resolve these NTBs. And this is quite high in the political agenda of the integration process. And it has been very successful with actually 95 NTBs that were identified and resolved. However, the NTBs continue to appear. I mean, they are new and there are others that are proved hard to solve. And just to highlight the relevance of these, NTBs clearly reappeared during the COVID-19 crisis and affected, for example, the flow of essential medical supplies and other input in the trade within the region, as for example, lorry drivers couldn't cross the border, etc. So that is a sort of NTB. If we can go to the next slide, I would basically said the objectives of the project were basically, as I said, was measure the size of the existing NTBs and identify how affect them the region, and basically quantify the impact of removing these NTBs and their effects on trade, production, employment, and poverty. If we go to the next slide, we can see how basically since 2014, the time required to transport goods between Mombasa and Kampala in the northern corridor, that was basically the case that we analyzed, has fallen. And this has been quite a significant achievement so far, where basically there have been significant reductions along the line. However, the time is quite split evenly between basically the time of the move, that's basically affected by how fast you can drive, stop for personal reasons, and the waiting times, where basically this is where most of the NTBs that we analyze are there. Can we go to the next slide, please? In the basically, what just to illustrate, there are around 37 hours that were spent at that time in basically on policy roadblocks and other foreseen circumstances. Some of them, for example, were way breaches. And this reduction on times how also affected a bit the reduction on prices of transport. However, most of that has been attributed to the fall of oil prices at that time when we did that, and also some fall in a more competitive pressure. If we can go to the next slide, I can show you how basically the cost has fallen since 2013. The cost of transport has fallen, in part attributed to some of the actions associated to the can we go to the next slide, please? Associated to the basically the reduction in the fuel cost and other reductions. In the next slide, basically, I'm going to go quickly because I want to go straight to the results. Some of the that is the time and cost assessment. Can we go to the next slide, please? Where basically the transport has experienced a significant reduction, as I said, because of the price of fuel, a greater competitive pressure. Further reduction on the transport cost needs to come for a continued reduction on the transport times. And this depends on increasing the transit speed that at the end depends on the infrastructure. It's not that you have to make the lorries go faster, but it depends on basically on the infrastructure, which will facilitate basically the reduction in the capital requirements and greater fuel efficiency. In the next slide, we basically, I can show you the estimations of what is called ad valorem equivalence of some NTBs. And basically, if we add them together, we have identified many of these NTBs, such as way breaches, border delays, bribes, road usage fees, etc. They could range between 3% and 16% of the cost of the product. So it's a significant number. So that means that all these NTBs is on average are making the products, many of the products are made in between 3% and 16% more expensive for consumers on one side, or also to be exported. So if you think, for example, of a product that is produced in Uganda that wants to be exported to China, the summation of these NTBs could make that product as high as 16% more expensive for exporting. In the next slide, just to show you some of the results, we calculate how the consumer prices in 4 countries of the EAC can fall if these NTBs are reduced. And for example, in the case of Kenya, if all the NTBs were resolved, which is not realistically possible, but this is just that could lead to a fall in consumer prices of up to 3%. But even in Rwanda, that could be almost as high as 1.8%. So it's a significant reduction on the average consumer price. It would mean that things on average would be that cheaper. In the next slide, I show you the impact that addressing these NTBs will have on trade, measured in terms of imports, and on the GDP. And addressing all these NTBs clearly may lead to gains on income of the countries between 1.8 and 2.8%. So there are significant gains in terms of GDP. But even addressing one particular NTB, such as, for example, weight breaches, for example, may generate some seizable gains, because we are talking about gains of around 0.3%. And this is still, for something that small, that simple, is still a big gain. Just to summarize my presentation in the next slide, there have been a major commitment to address NTBs. There have been some actions, such as the one-stop border post, that have contributed to the reduction of times and cost of transport. But still, NTBs affect the performance of the transport sector and the economy in general. And as I said, NTBs could represent between 3% and 60% of the cost of the product. So this is quite important. Further, in addition of addressing these NTBs, further reduction in the transport costs will need to come from increasing the transit times, because a significant share of the times is on the road times. However, there are some very low cost actions, such as addressing weight breaches or bribes or delays, that can be extremely beneficial. So basically, when you measure in terms of the value for money of what you get in addressing these NTBs, these are quite significant issues. And the relevance of NTBs became very evident during the COVID-19 crisis, with many medical supplies, input and food being slowed at the borders because of many health concerns. And the response, the importance of addressing these NTBs was considered in the response adopted immediately, for example, by Trade Markets Africa, in the program what they designed that is called Safe Trade, to actually to continue smoothing the trade through the borders at the moment of the pandemic. So thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you so much for that presentation and for keeping time. We'll move from NTBs to small-scale mining. Welcome, James.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me here today. My name is James McQuilkin, and I'm a Programme Officer with PACT, and we're a global development organisation and UK registered charity. And our Mines to Markets programme, which is through which we undertook this work, normally we undertake research, training and development projects in about 20 countries worldwide, many of which in sub-Saharan Africa, and mainly many of them focused on artisanal and small-scale mining. So it really is an area of expertise for us. So yeah, I'm here today to share some findings of this study that really examined the economic contributions and tried to quantify and qualify some of those in terms of small-scale mining in East Africa. And we undertook this project in 2017 with our partner Alliance for Responsible Mining. Thank you. Yes, so there were two main objectives of the research. The first one is to conduct this overarching synthesis to understand these impacts, especially on livelihoods, and focus on low and middle income countries. And the second one is to explore what these implications are in terms of informing future programming of DFID and other development partners. Next slide, please. So in terms of that overarching synthesis of the sector, and I'm hoping the next slide will appear. Yep, fantastic. I know there's a delay. What were our main findings? Well, nothing particularly surprising, nothing particularly new, but certainly very important in terms of further increasing and underscoring the importance of artisanal small-scale mining to development and to economic and social growth. So approximately, we estimated there were about 40 million people who work in artisanal small-scale mining. This number has now been revised further by the World Bank and PACT in another piece of research through Delve to about 42 million and counting. And really, small-scale mining is an opportunity to escape poverty. And as a result, it's pretty much ubiquitous in low and middle income countries, with less in higher income countries, but it can be found in places like Canada, Australia, and some parts of Europe. Our findings show from the desk review that there was many positive impacts. However, these are also mitigated or damaged by some negative impacts, especially on local communities in terms of environmental impacts. And again, these economic impacts are generally positive, but the social impacts as a result of really the informality of the sector are quite damaging. And they can have some political cost, particularly in terms of the role of ASM, not necessarily in creating conflict, but perhaps in helping fund armed groups, for example. But overall, artisanal small-scale mining is most certainly a net positive economic contribution to poverty reduction and economic growth. And we need to address some of these issues of informality to really realise the importance of the sector to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and really unlock its big potential. So we undertook further deeper analysis in 3 countries, Kenya, Rwanda and Uganda. So in Kenya, you can see the main findings here. There's about 800,000 people in Kenyan citizens who are directly dependent on artisanal small-scale mining. But you can even multiply that number by 6, which includes people such as taxi drivers, cooks, and others that are deriving an indirect income from the artisanal small-scale mining sector. And this is common in all 3 countries, to be honest. In terms of actually quantifying some of the economic contributions, you can see from the statistics here, it's about $225 million a year that gold mining alone is generating at the national level, which is a huge amount in terms of its economic contribution. In Taita Taveta alone, gemstone mining again is 120 million per year, and many of which is spent locally. So it really has local and national impacts. And together, over $500 million per year. And then there's some key needs here at the bottom in terms of occupational health and safety, improved extraction and processing to enable miners to get even more money for their gold and invest and create wealth in their local communities. And as part of that, there's some policy reform that's required. And you can see the gender division of labour there on the right there, showing that women are a key part, especially in processing activities. Next slide, please. So when we look at Rwanda, we found broadly similar impacts, so to speak. There's about 400,000 Rwandan citizens who are dependent on ASM. And again, the multiplier effect certainly applies here. And what's interesting about Rwanda is the use of the International Supply Chain Initiative, which helps to manage risks and due diligence according to the Dodd-Frank law and conflict mineral legislation in Rwanda, neighbouring countries such as Congo. In any case, what this means is that the sector is really highly formalised and regulated and legalised in that sense. And as a result, there's even further positive impacts to miners. They're able to be paid through banking systems. Actually, the government revenues from the ASM sector contribute about 20% of exports, and it's actually behind coffee and tea. It's the second largest to the economy. So very, very important there, again, to the country, its citizens. However, similar issues also found and needs that need addressing. If we move to Uganda, the story is kind of much the same. I guess the only other thing to say about Rwanda is that it's a different set of minerals. It's mainly tin, tungsten, tantalum. So in Uganda mainly is gold and clay and brick production. There's about 5 million citizens who are dependent on ASM. And in terms of quantifying this impact, yeah, again, $500 million, which is huge sums of money. And again, with that local investment in the economy, in local communities, given that these revenues are often spent locally. Women are very important in Uganda as well. However, as elsewhere, in fact, often they don't have much power within small-scale mining and occupy roles that are potentially lower paid, and also face other kind of gender discrimination within the sector. Child labour is also found, especially in areas where small-scale mining is less formalised. Yeah, I think another really interesting finding there at the very end is that if you can include, if you can formalise artisanal small-scale mining, then it would increase GDP by 5%. So yeah, the main message here, before we jump to the final slide, is that the artisanal and small-scale mining sector, as our study shows, is often forgotten. But once you start quantifying and qualifying it and demonstrating its importance economically to development, then you can really make the case for investing in it and formalising it and supporting the sector and its communities more widely. So in terms of the outcomes and additional impact of the research, beyond demonstrating its importance to policymakers and development partners, in Kenya, the UK government funded the KX program, which included some workshops to support the development of artisanal mining strategy. In Rwanda, it actually was used multiple times, and I realize I've got about 30 seconds here, to support the Sustainable Development of Mining in Rwanda program, which PACT actually implemented alongside Cardno, and I personally worked on in Rwanda for about a year. And yeah, I can attest to the fact that the study was used to inform many of the interventions, access to finance, women's economic empowerment, etc. So it was very useful and informative in having that baseline. And in Uganda, while no DFID follow-on program has occurred, there are many opportunities to actually implement some of the recommendations. And also, a study by the UNDP actually took an entire baseline of the sector about a year later, of development minerals, and quantified its contribution of about 1.4%. So clearly, this study that we undertook through EARF, thank you, has also inspired other efforts to kind of undertake baseline studies on ASM. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks again for this great opportunity to share findings of the research. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Always good to hear about uptake and impact of studies. So we'll hear from a project assistant to the Ministry of Environment and Forestry in Kenya, and how some of the findings, supported their work around developing the national action plan in the mining sector. So we'll hear from him through a video.
The journey for addressing mercury use in artisanal and small-scale gold mining in Kenya began with the development of the Mercury Action Plan in 2016-2017, and then a national action plan picked up from 2017 up to date. And currently we have the Planet Gold, which resulted from National Action Plan. National Action Plan is a wider scope that encompasses the Planet Gold and other projects that will come in place. And the Planet Gold is important in Kenya because it addresses the use of mercury by reducing and finally eliminating mercury use in artisanal and small-scale gold mining sector in Kenya. This Planet Gold project is very important because one, it addresses the issues of formalization, that is issuing of permits to miners. Number two, market access to miners. And number three is financial access in terms of credits or other loans to the miners. And lastly is provision of alternative technologies to the artisanal and small-scale gold miners in Kenya, which will address the use of mercury in a wider scope. And by the end of this project, we anticipate to reduce or to eliminate the use of mercury in the sector. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Please feel free to pop your questions into the chat as we welcome the third presentation from Ian at Intervistas.
Hello, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to speak here. My name is Ian Kincaid. I'm Vice President of Economic Analysis at Intervistas Consulting, which is a transportation and tourism consultancy. And I'm going to talk about a study we did in 2016 and 2017, looking at the liberalization of air markets, or what we call open skies in East Africa. Next slide, please. So when we talk about open skies, we're talking about what are called bilateral air service agreements. Air service between different countries is regulated by an agreement between those two countries at a sort of diplomatic level. Historically, those agreements globally have been quite restrictive. They've specified the capacity that can be operated on the routes, which airlines can be operated, which airports can be served, and in some cases, what fares can be offered on those routes. The impact of this is it has restricted competition and innovation. So what we've seen across the globe is a move towards what we call open skies. So that's changing the agreement so there's no restrictions on operations other than safety and security requirements. But as long as the carrier meets those requirements, they are free to operate with whatever capacity and pricing that they choose. And we've seen the benefits in other markets where that's led to growth in air services and better connectivity. In the case of Africa, the Yamoussoukro decision was signed in 1999, which was signed by about 44 African nations looking to liberalize air markets in Africa. The progress on that decision has been very slow, so we've seen very little opening up of air markets. And this study was to look at what would be the benefits and the costs of liberalizing in line with the Yamoussoukro decision in East Africa, at least. So the study was looking at what would be the impacts based on evidence that we were able to collect in Africa and elsewhere, and some of the costs and benefits more broadly to the economy as well as the aviation industry. Next slide, please. So we looked at this a number of different ways. We looked at the evidence from around the globe. We can see liberalization has occurred in North America, in Europe, and in parts of Asia, and that provides an evidence base of what might happen in Africa. We also talked to stakeholders across East Africa. There were 5 countries. We talked to not just aviation authorities and airlines, but also industries that benefit from aviation. So tourism, trade, business, and investment as well. So we're trying to get a clear picture of what it meant for the entire economy, not just for the aviation industry. And we also conducted econometric analysis, looking at where there have been rare instances of liberalization in Africa, what have been the impacts on the market? Yeah, next slide, thank you. So I'm going to jump to some of the quantitative findings that we found. The results we got from our analysis supported what we'd seen elsewhere, which is that with liberalization, moving to open skies, what you see is a reduction in fares as there's greater competition in the market, improved efficiencies, more innovation. You also see a much larger increase in capacity, as much as 40%, as carriers look to respond to demand, stimulate demand, and look at opening up new routes. So perhaps operating secondary markets between the two countries. What was interesting in this analysis is that we found that you had to go the whole way to get the real benefit. So partial liberalization, removing some of the restrictions, but leaving others in place, didn't have much of an impact. It was only when you created an open market for carriers to operate in that you start to see those full benefits. Sorry, I've lost the presentation here. Okay,
Stella?
Yeah, I've lost the presentation. I'll try and go on memory then. There you go. Thank you. Could we move to the next slide, please? So, as I said, the benefits from air service liberalisation are much larger than just what happens in the aviation industry. Certainly, there are benefits within the aviation industry. You have new players come into the market, new market opportunities. That tends to lead to greater employment, greater investment in that sector, and that has quite strong multiplier impact. So industries that supply the aviation industry benefit as well. But as I indicated before, there are broader benefits as aviation facilitates a wide range of activities. Probably the most obvious one is tourism. And our study did include Kenya and Tanzania with highly developed tourism markets. So with that liberalization, it allows tourists, African tourists, but also tourists from further afield who want to connect through multiple countries. And that allows more opportunities for tourism development, which in turn generates jobs and increased spending. And also there's what we call the catalytic impacts, which is other broader industries that benefit. Trade is one, the trade in goods. Obviously, if you have more air service, you have belly capacity for cargo, but you also have people able to access markets, sell their goods or their services in those markets. And that gets made easier by better connectivity in air services. You also see, and we document this in a report, investment and business location decisions being influenced by air service. Businesses looking to expand will go where there's good air services so they can access markets, they can get back to their headquarters and so on. So when we look at all of that, and we conducted modeling to do all of that, we found quite large impacts that could arise from liberalization. If we look at the whole of the EAC, the jobs impact could be as much as 46,000 additional jobs across a range of sectors and over $200 million US in GDP. The impacts of these vary between countries depending on the level of liberalization they've already undertaken, the air service and the structure of their economies, but also significant benefits from what is a relatively simple policy change. And that's backed up by what we saw happening in the past in Europe and other parts of the world. Next slide, please. In terms of going forward, next steps, while we were able to identify clear benefits from liberalization, liberalization is a necessary but not sufficient condition for these benefits to arise. The actual policy has to be put in place firstly, and some of the institutional measures need to be made to do that. That's underway, and there's a lot that can be learned from what's happened in other parts of the world. But we also found from talking to stakeholders there were other issues that were holding back the aviation industry. Taxation was one that was felt to be fairly high, and the cost of operation, and we did benchmark that against other parts of the world, and it was noticeably higher. And also the infrastructure. Clearly, as you grow air service, you need the infrastructure that can support that. You need the security, and you also need the training of aviation professionals that have the skills necessary to support those air services. And more broadly, while we looked at East Africa, and certainly the Yamoussoukro decision had a regional as well as continental focus, that there are even greater benefits if the entire continent liberalized. And there is a program underway that we're working with the African Union on, the Single Africa Air Transport Market, or SATAM. And this is seeking to push forward with the Yamoussoukro and get some new initiative to that so that we can have all of the African Union countries ultimately signed up to an open skies in the same way we see an open skies region within the European Union. So far, 34 nations have signed up out of 55, and there are positive signs that this is being implemented. And once that's done, the benefits for East Africa will be even greater than the numbers I just presented. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Ian. Very interesting. We'll move to the final presentation from Jason. Over to you, Jason.
Thanks very much, and good morning to everyone. So we can, if we go to the first slide. Or the second slide, the slide with some content on it. There we go. So this was a large contextualization study, sort of background study for the research hub that took place, unfortunately, sort of began in around March 2020. So under not great circumstances to start a new project, which did affect our methodology and the scope of the project. But the objective was to look at the sort of historical background, recent developments in the way that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Turkey have been engaging in the Horn of Africa with research focused on Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Somaliland, and to some extent Djibouti. This included a range of quite a range of entry points, some of which are related to economic drivers, which I expect is why we're presenting these findings in this panel, although this is not really a study about prosperity or economic development. Sorry, the study is not focused on those themes exclusively. So there's an entry point around maritime security and multilateral engagement in the wider Red Sea region, looking at the 2020 launch of a new Council of Arab and African Coastal States of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, which is quite a mouthful, driven by Saudi Arabia. We're looking at the way these actors from the Gulf and Turkey prioritize their foreign policy objectives within their own domestic agenda, cooperate and compete in the region, in the Horn, and with each other, sort of in the context of their operations and objectives elsewhere in the near abroad from the Horn of Africa. We've looked at investment from Turkey and the Gulf states in the region, as well as other economic dimensions related to aid and humanitarian engagement, where Turkey and the Gulf states are increasingly key actors, as well as social and cultural engagement along the lines of soft power, education, engagement, the influence of culture and media. So, as I mentioned, the study sort of came online right as the COVID pandemic broke out, which affected our initial field-based approach. However, this was a team-based project, so we did already have researchers in Khartoum, Sudan, Asaba, Ethiopia, and Mogadishu, Somalia, as well as a researcher who was based in Istanbul, which helped. And then the rest of the team were based in the UK, engaging with Eritrea, Djibouti, myself, with a sort of overall view of the whole project, and our researcher based or focused on the Gulf states, who was grounded in the UK rather than his normal peregrinations, including regular travel to the Gulf. Most of the work was carried out late last year, and there were a few interviews in the last few weeks to capture fast-moving events in the region, which you're probably aware are quite intense. So we've got a range of findings, some of which I will go over quickly here because they're less relevant for maybe this discussion, but are worth flagging up. The scale of the resources in particular that Turkey and the Gulf states are bringing to bear through business, humanitarian, or security engagement in the Horn of Africa is quite substantial, especially in terms of the scale of the economies in the Horn of Africa. But that doesn't necessarily translate into the level of priority policy-wise for Turkey, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Qataris that their counterparts in the Horn of Africa seem to perceive. They seem to think that those actors have more significant strategic objectives in Sudan or in Somalia or in Ethiopia than those policymakers in Ankara or Doha or Riyadh do in practice. But it's also important to remember that the countries in the Horn of Africa have their own objectives. Sudan and Ethiopia are undergoing very tense, fraught political transitions at the moment. But despite this, Sudan has increasingly been asserting its own interests in its strategic position on the Red Sea, through which this new council focused on the Red Sea is potentially an important platform, and its engagement with the wider region, as well as within the Nile Basin context in relation to Ethiopia's Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, this very large hydropower plant being constructed on the Ethiopia-Sudan border on the Blue Nile, in contrast to the history where Sudan has sometimes found itself being treated as a sort of pawn between larger stakeholders, Egyptians or Ethiopians or the Gulf states. They're looking to more effectively leverage their strategic position. Ethiopia's internal instability is undermining its ability to leverage relations that have improved significantly with the Gulf states in the last 2 or 3 years since Abiy Ahmed has come to power, following sort of internal unrest and transitions within the ruling party, especially as regards the Nile Basin. And they are not included in the Red Sea Council that's emerged. So its position for a player which has historically been very effective at asserting its interests in the region has started to wobble a bit. Eritrea's agenda, and we can talk about this if you guys are interested, tends to be characterized by sort of surface level analysis as a spoiler in the region. In reality, the more nuanced reading would be that it's a small actor with limited resources that's looking to ensure, in the context of a very fraught history, that its position is not undermined by instability in neighboring countries or the agendas of neighboring countries, especially Ethiopia and Sudan, or now in more recent context, destabilization from the wider region in terms of Gulf states crises, the Arab uprisings, etc. In Somalia, the influence of the Gulf states, in particular Turkey, has been increasing. Since 2017, the row that was patched over earlier in this year, in the last few weeks, between Qatar on one side and the Saudi, Emirati, Egyptian, Bahraini alliance on the other, that row resulted in some very significant changes in the way that the Emiratis in particular and the Saudis have engaged with the federal government versus sub-national units of governance in Somalia. And that has added to the volatility in the transition in Somalia towards multi-party democratic order. We may or may not have had an Emirati ambassador appointed to Somaliland in the last few days, and that's another sort of provocation in that vein. Turkey's a particularly interesting actor in this case, in that its opening to Africa strategy, which has been going on for quite some time, since the late 1990s, has been heavily embedded into the party politics of President Erdogan's Justice and Development Party, the AKP. And that kind of party, the embeddedness of policy in a party, raises questions about Turkey's engagement over the medium term. It's certainly become a very coherent actor in the region, although its more recent economic woes and other challenges in the last few years have lowered the priority of the Horn of Africa for Turkey in its overall objectives. There's another essential driver of policy within the region towards the Horn and within the wider Red Sea, which is shifts in US policy over the last 10, 15 years towards Iran. When we had the elections at the end of last year, this triggered, in the US, this triggered a very significant shift in the way that the Saudis and Emiratis were positioning themselves vis-a-vis Qatar. That row between 2017 and 2021 did enhance and sort of solidify the linkages between Turkey and Qatar in terms of cooperation, including in the Horn of Africa. Those links are likely to persist. Go to the next slide. In terms of economic and soft power dynamics, the Gulf states tend to take a quite transactional, instrumental approach towards investment and aid flows. However, many of these investment flows and even development assistance can be opaque, leading to difficulties in measuring flows. Different studies have been done drawing on publicly available data and more in-depth research coming to strikingly different amounts in the last couple of years. So there's much happening sort of in a black box in terms of the way financial resources are flowing between the Gulf and the Horn. But we can see some patterns emerging. One is that investment in Sudan is quite long-standing. There have been some significant aid and investment announcements in the last few years since the transition began in terms of propping up that government. The Emirati and Sudanese rapprochement or normalization of relations with Israel adds another sort of dimension to economic collaboration, especially Emirati sort of quid pro quo reward for Sudanese participation in that process through investment, through support to the central bank in Sudan. Ethiopia is an increasing focus for the Gulf states, both for the sort of typical narrative around food security in the Gulf, given climate conditions there, and the role of Sudan in the longer term and increasingly Ethiopia as a key source of agricultural output for the markets in Saudi and Emirati and other Gulf markets. Those things are key, but Ethiopia, Sudan, these are also important consumer markets, and Ethiopia in particular under Abiy has been driving the liberalization of certain elements of key sectors, telecoms, energy, in particular, that offer opportunities for Gulf investors, and we'll see that moving forward. Emirati efforts, especially from Dubai, and there is a tendency for policy across the UAE to be somewhat disjointed, with different emirates pursuing slightly different policies, but Dubai in particular has been trying to take more formal roles in international humanitarian architecture, which has some implications for the region through the Islamic Development Bank and through existing Muslim world, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, and etc. There are existing humanitarian linkages also institutionalized. Bahrain's a key player. Bahrain was outside the scope of this. Kuwait is another key player. And the Emiratis, especially Dubai, seem to be wanting to step into that mix as well. Doha's role towards the region has been slightly different, also transactional, but they seem to have a slightly different vision of Qatar's role in the region, or Qatar's role in the global role. as a mediator, as a sort of influencer. Their efforts have been concentrated on Sudan, looking at Darfur, going back a ways. Their influence in the current transition has been diluted significantly because of the Gulf states crisis and the increased role of the Saudis and Emiratis in the Sudanese transition. And Somalia, so quite long-standing pattern of Qatari engagement with political elites in the Somali context. Currently, the federal presidential administration around Farmajo has these links. This is kind of the first time the Doha, the horse that Doha has backed has ended up staying in power and maintaining their links to Qatar. In the past, this has been a mixed result strategy where they tend to have better connections to folks on the outside than folks who've got in. But things are a bit of a mess with the Somali political transition at the moment, in that the mandate of the government is run out and there is an impasse over the way to proceed towards elections. In contrast, Turkey's strategy, where private sector, party connected, or not necessarily party officials, but folks with key links to the AKP and the government, as well as official agencies, development, cultural exchange, cultural investments in restoration, renovation projects around Ottoman history in the region, educational charities, scholarship, humanitarian front, are quite linked up. So even if all of the actors aren't connected directly to the government, Turkey benefits from a perception that if Turkey wants to support its relationship with a government or with an actor in the country in the Horn of Africa, it will be able to coordinate and bring to bear a range of instruments to support its ambition. In practice, that doesn't always work so smoothly, but the perception has been quite beneficial to its reputation in the region as a joined up actor. Sometimes, though, this does generate a bit of blowback. We saw that in Sudan in particular, where Turkish businesses are seen to sort of be able to bring resources to bear to outcompete Sudanese businesses. And that's not always positive, even if on the cultural, humanitarian, and sort of development front, or certain Sudanese business actors may be able to participate and benefit from that. And then the last slide. Thank you. So just very briefly, this is a very volatile moment in the region, in the Horn of Africa, which was the focus of the study. There are crises gripping the region. So we've mentioned the Ethiopian political transition, which obviously since November has intensified with the outbreak of the war in Tigray. There are a range of other political issues that are still not resolved as the country heads towards elections in June. So that's going to be a key thing to watch over the next few months and going forward after that. The Sudanese political transition is also fraught and not over. Somalia's political crisis we just mentioned. The tensions over the development of the dam on the Blue Nile are set to escalate and intensify again as the rainy season approaches in Ethiopia, and the buildup of the dam's capacity in terms of its construction, the stage of its construction, will lead to more filling this year. That led to sort of an intense moment last year, with a very different U.S. administration playing a role as a mediator there, and trying to play a role as a mediator, but also taking some very some positions in support of Egypt that were perceived very negatively in Ethiopia. So undermining the tripartite process there. And then the last couple of factors around U.S. engagement with Iran, how that's going to affect the positions of the Gulf states in terms of their reliance on the U.S. as a security actor, and the options available to them as middle powers, projecting and protecting their influence and interests. And Turkey, there are myriad effects from coronavirus, the restrictions on travel, the economic fallout is still dropping. Its footprint in the Horn of Africa has been affected by that, and that will continue to play out over the next year. So happy to take any questions on that.
Thank you so much, Jason, for that very insightful presentation on the Horn of Africa and the engagement of the Middle Eastern Gulf states and Turkey. I'll ask Charles Tonue from the African Center for Technology Studies to very quickly, in 5 minutes or less, share his contribution on promoting green economies in East Africa from one of their studies. So Charles, you're welcome. Charles, are you on the call? All right, as we wait for Charles, I think we'll go to our discussant, Eric. Eric, if you could just also give your reflections from the 4 studies, a lot, but just based on your experience working in Uganda and the region, I'll invite you to give us your quick reflections from the studies. Over to you. You're on mute. Eric, you're on mute.
Hello?
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope I'm audible enough. And
yes,
just it's a great pleasure to have attended this session that highlights the significance of research on economic development and prosperity in the East African region. I'd say the four discussions are really quite interesting in the way they look at the issues that are being discussed, and so I just wanted to just run briefly through them just to give my reflections, just in order to understand how my reflections come about. My role is to support mainly UK business in working in Uganda and to support those that are also interested in the East African region. And so I come from that background of a business support background. And on the discussion on the non-tariff barriers, it was quite striking to see the importance of removing the non-tariff barriers and how they affect product price and also how they could affect the GDP. The GDPs of different economies in the East African region. And so just of recent, you know, we have had just recently, as of last week, there's been the discussion about agricultural exports, say from Uganda into Kenya and vice versa from Kenya into Uganda, with certain restrictions beginning to show up, which will affect trade. But a question I just wanted to ask Max, which is who was the discussant, and that just to begin the question and answer session after my discussion, is in terms of the way you see decision making and policy making in the East African region, within the East African community. How much do you see research actually supports the decision making and the development of policies? How much does research inform these decisions vis-a-vis the politics and other other decision-making influencers. So just wanted to check with you, based on this interaction you've had on this research, how much of that effect is there in terms of the decision-making. When we go into the presentation on small-scale artisanal mining, I was quite struck with the numbers of the population that are actually involved in what is not a very much talked sector of the economy. When people are looking at job creation in these economies, rarely do they discuss artisanal mining as a job creation facility. And so for me, it was quite striking in terms of the numbers of people involved, the numbers of women being employed, and also just the revelations of children and child workers in this sector. And just a question for the discussant, James, is sorry, for the presenter, James, is you can see that the effect of artisanal mining on the GDP, if considered, is quite high. And I'm just wondering, in your view, based on the research that you have done, how sustainable is it for countries in East Africa to actually use artisanal mining as a job creation and economic generation tool, given its limitations, and also these are limited resources that will one day be exhausted? How sustainable do you think it is for these economies to actually invest in development of these from a job creation perspective? When I come to the presentation on the cost and benefits of open skies in the East African community by Ian, given the new trend of nationalization of the countries in terms of their flights and national airlines, and the emergence of these. Just Tanzania recently came on board, so has Uganda quite recently. I think Burundi at some stage may consider having a national airline, just like Rwanda and Kenya have existing national airlines. And I do see that from your presentation, the benefits of liberalization and opening the skies are quite striking. I mean, they're high when you look at a reduction in airfare prices of almost 9%, increased capacity, and their benefits to the GDP. And the job creation. So the benefits are there. They stand out in terms of your presentation. But just wondering, why is it that opening the skies is not being considered very favorably with the governments? Why aren't they taking these steps more seriously? Why, based on your research, why do you think that there is so much resistance? And what is that effect of the nationalization of airlines on the open skies agenda, and how that can be handled? So I just wanted to throw that question out there for you, Ian, when we come into the question and answer session. And lastly, based on the last presentation on the effect of Turkey and Gulf states in the Horn of Africa, from an economic perspective and from a business perspective, it was a more challenging kind of presentation in terms of there are many layers of interaction between the Gulf states and Turkey with the Horn of Africa, and each interaction looks very different depending on the country within the Horn of Africa that these Gulf states and Turkey are relating to. In some cases, the relationships look like they are political in nature, others are economic in nature, and others are security influence. And so that there's that, you can see that there is a mix of reasons within how these relationships are being spearheaded and how they're working. And just asking and throwing out this question up there to you, Jason. Obviously you've spent a lot of time on this research at a very interesting time in terms of global politics, that things have been changing quite rapidly. If I was say a policymaker or a leader in one of these countries in the Horn of Africa, how would I use the kind of findings of your research to strengthen my position within the Horn of Africa in the interaction with the Gulf states and with Turkey? Because on the one hand, it feels like these Gulf states, it feels like a one-sided type of relationship. How do you then strengthen the relationships of the countries within the Horn in dealing with Turkey and the Gulf states? So other than that, thank you so much. These have been very insightful presentations, which were very clear and very relevant to the economy and growth within the sectors in this region. Thank you. Over back to you, Emmy. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Eric, for your reflections and for kicking us off into the Q&A. I will try to recap your question as well as the questions that are coming from the chat. I think we will start with Dr. Maximiliano and the first presentation. So we have a question. We have two questions around impact. Dr. Maximiliano, we have a question around would you be able to disaggregate the impact of poor infrastructure compared with poor procedures? And then the impact of the cost of, so let me just say the question, do the possible low-cost easy wins vary by country? So if travel time is basically fixed, then does the extent to which actions make a difference depend partly on where you are, i.e. different actions have different impacts if you're a long way from the coast like Rwanda? And then the third question that you would respond to is the question from Eric just now. How much do you see this research supporting decision makers in the region? How much does the research and the evidence inform decision making versus the politics and all the other influences that come along with policy making? Over to you, Maximiliano.
Yes, thank you very much for the questions. Let me go with the last questions first. With respect to the incidence of the times and the cost, clearly that depends on the product involved, particularly on the cost side. So clearly there are some products for which the NTBs tend to have a higher incidence than in others. So on one side, that is could potentially explain differential in terms of the differences in terms of the impact in one country and in another. That depends on the type of export profile of each of the countries. In terms of the whether it's possible to disaggregate the impact with respect to the infrastructure and what are the poor procedures, we in the study we look into specifically into the type of NTBs that were being raised by the stakeholders, etc. There was a clear evidence that there wasn't much issues associated with infrastructure as such, but were more associated with procedures. So clearly, the fact that you have weight breaches, many times you have a multiplication of weight breaches, such as like a truck can change of weight substantially from one way breach to the other. That was a sort of an issue of concern, and that is more associated with how things are applied. I mean, nobody is opposing that the government, check the weights of the trucks, so actually to check that they are not damaging the infrastructure, but it's not necessary to do that 5 times on the same route. So I think that clearly there was an issue associated. We didn't look much into the infrastructure issues because clearly that is something that is a bit beyond basically the NTB space. And the question of the commentator about how much research support the decision to address that, I think that it definitely is supporting the political decision to go and address the NTBs. Clearly, this type of research absolutely help on that, and basically they help to illustrate how important is to to address that for the economies and people. I think that the thing that is research is not much there, or evidence, not research, but evidence is not much there, is at the time when NTVs are basically created. I mean, there isn't a clear idea of try to assess the impact that a particular measure may have on trade. Sometimes that is absent. So clearly there is evidence to solve the issue once it's presented, but there is no evidence to actually prevent the issues, or particularly prevent NTVs from happening. Thank you for the questions and comments.
Thank you. Thank you so much for responding and keeping time also in your response. If there are any follow-up questions to that, if you feel you want some more clarification, please put them in the chat. And I'll also encourage the panelists to respond on the chat as well. Feel free to engage on chat with the participants. I'll move quickly to the next presentation. The questions from that. Watipaso Mkandawire is asking an example of how the sector, the small artisanal small-scale mining sector, could be formalized, and what would be the incentives for that if miners do opt for formalization. Is it around registration and taxation? And then we had a question from Laila asking about, is there data about the average mine earnings of local communities and individuals who rely on small-scale mining, and the sustainability of income also? And I think this also links to Eric's question around, how sustainable is it for countries if they were to really invest in promoting this sector? Over to you.
Brilliant, thank you, Emmy, and thank you all for your questions. Really great questions. So starting with formalization, really I think formalization needs to be seen as a process that sits on a spectrum, and it comprises mainly two things, essentially kind of the legal rights and the governance and having the permit and the ability to mine, and that's kind of the rights-based approach to formalization. And the second part is, in terms of formalization, is having the support and knowledge in order to improve and implement best practice mining on a small scale in terms of operational efficiency, productivity, good social working conditions, meeting high standards of environmental impact. So in terms of how you achieve that, then formalization programs and projects, well, they need to often include perhaps some governance reform to make space within mining legal frameworks for small scale mining. Oftentimes, or certainly in the past, in about the last 10 years, there has been a lot of reform also in East Africa. But yes, changing up the legal framework to allow small scale miners, communities to easily gain a license and make space and create the ability for large scale mines even to allow land on their concession to be given over to small scale miners. And then also, support programs in terms of accessing finance, capacity building training that can come from development partners, government themselves. And really, small scale mining cuts across all 17 sustainable development goals. So other development programs as well can mainstream small scale mining into these other areas. So really formalization needs to be done on a kind of tailored and country and local mining context, because there is a really high variety on the ground in terms of activities and operations. And also it can mean different things to a policymaker or a government that might just think it's licensing versus a community member. And again, mining itself is on a spectrum in terms of small scale mining. So you have the artisanal miner with a shovel and a spade, up to small scale miners using dozers, diggers, and kind of powered tools. So you need a kind of variety of approach that captures all. So in terms of incentives to formalize, well, if you can conceptualize small scale miners as already being taxed when they work in the informal sector. So they kind of pay taxes in terms of costs to landowners, traders, local community. They might be investing in schools in order to have that social license to operate even informally. And also in terms of kind of bribery to move minerals around, you may have to pay bribes at roadblocks, etc. in certain countries. So they're already being taxed. So in terms of creating the incentives to formalize, the government also and other partners need to look at ways of making the licensing process easier, so that I don't have to perhaps travel all the way to the capital city, sit for 2 or 3 months before I get a response to get a license. So that needs to be simplified Also, there needs to be, in return of getting a license, then access to training and support, as kind of I highlighted, a geological survey, for example, to know that you're hitting the right part of the mineral area. So I think that's kind of like the formalization piece. If we take the sustainability piece and question from Eric and roll it into this other question as well around kind of average earnings, the short answer is yes. There is good evidence of the average earnings, and we report some of these in our study as well. So I've picked a few out very quickly. In Rwanda, at one mine site of about 500 workers, they're retaining 41% of the production value as their wages. And then again, at another mine site of over 600 workers, they're receiving about 55% of the total export value before deductions are made automatically in terms of social insurance. So definitely they are receiving a good income that is sustainable. But in many cases as well, as we show in the study, they are also investing in their own personal development and communities. So a good example is the interlinkages between mining and farming. So some of the quicker and faster returns from mining, small-scale mining, are often invested in agriculture to buy equipment, seeds, fertilizers, and also there's often a seasonal interlinkage between mining and farming in rural communities. So they actually balance each other well. And then we also highlight this in the study too. And I've personally met gold miners who are paying for their kids to attend some of the top schools in the capital cities, and also youth, 15 to 18-year-olds who are mining perhaps at the weekends or after school and using that to pay school fees. So there are definitely positive impacts. The kind of question or the issue is ensuring that those positive impacts, can be achieved really by properly managing and managing the sector essentially, and providing additional support. So that leads into, very briefly, the final kind of sustainability question. I think, as I kind of highlighted, ASM really does cut across all 17 SDGs, and it also needs to be seen against large-scale mining and mineral resource-led development, especially if we look across Africa, things like the Africa Mining Vision. Why not embed small-scale mining within that wider vision? And the reason why is that as the statistics kind of data showed, and this is why they're so important to encourage policymakers, government development partners to invest in the sector more. It's a huge driver of local wealth creation and job creation, and if properly managed through vocational education programs, you can really develop small-scale miners communities and skills that are applicable to other complementary livelihoods, such as mechanics, such as bookkeeping. These aren't just for small-scale mining, but you may start in the small-scale mining sector and then in future kind of graduate, so to speak, to other areas. And another area thing I wanted to highlight is that small-scale mining often targets much more marginal deposits than large-scale mining that just wouldn't be economical on a large scale, and also can take a lot longer to extract that. So they're actually taking advantage of other areas that a large-scale mining sector couldn't necessarily extract. And then the final point is that in order to move to, and this isn't in the study, but this has been shown by other studies since, there's a recent one by the World Bank. In order to have a decarbonized global economy and this green transition, we're going to need more minerals. And there's about 500% predicted increase in the amount of minerals that we'll need to meet demand by 2050. So small-scale mining isn't going away. By ignoring it, by not investing it, you push it further into the informal economy, further away from the ability to kind of tax it, manage it, and support it properly. So yes, it can definitely be a driver of sustainable development, and there's many positive impacts, provided it's properly managed and communities are part of that as well. Thank you. Great questions.
All right, there you have it, Eric. Small-scale mining isn't going anywhere, and it's cutting across all 17 of the SDGs. So yes, so I think we need to give it a little bit more attention than it's receiving right now. And you just made a good linkage to green economies. So I'll move to open skies, and the last question on the Horn of Africa. And I'll ask the panelists to take a minute each, because we want to hear from Charles towards the end. So to you, Ian, why is there resistance, and what's the impact of what we're seeing right now around nationalization of the air sector?
Hi, yes. In regards to national flag carriers and the emergence of new carriers, Open Skies itself doesn't preclude state-owned carriers competing in the market. They'll just be competing against private carriers, and there's plenty of examples where that happens. So the two aren't necessarily in opposition. I mean, one of the ideas behind the Yamoussoukro and the SATAM initiatives is that not, that there are relatively small countries that can't necessarily sustain a substantial airline. So one of the possibilities to have cross-country airlines that serve a number of carriers in sort of a number of nations and operate across those in the same way as you see a SAS in Europe or LATAM in South America. So it doesn't necessarily preclude it. Why there's been a reluctance, I think a lot of it is down to protectionism. The protection of the national carrier is seen as important. Our study in the reason lots of other countries move to open skies is because you're protecting one small segment of the economy at the expense of much larger segments of the economy, such as tourism and trade and so on. So there's a narrow focus, and often the airlines have the ear of policymakers, which helps. So that's led to some protectionism. Sometimes the carriers are a bit of a policy tool. The government wants to control their connectivity, and often this isn't entirely commercial, so they'll have air service to say the States or Europe when it's not economically viable. So but our point of our study was to say, you know, rather than focus on just the airline, which is a small part of the economy, you need to look at the broader benefits. And there are gains that be had by carriers. You know, there's plenty of examples we give in our report of carriers thriving under liberalization. So it's not necessarily the death knell of national carriers, but it's, if anything, opens up new opportunities and can improve efficiency.
Okay. Wow, thank you. Very quickly, in 1 minute, Jason, how would the research we've carried out strengthen interactions of the Horn of Africa countries with the countries like Turkey and the Middle Eastern Gulf states?
I think this is a great question, and I mentioned that for the Gulf states in particular, but to some degree even Turkey, the approach is transactional or sort of instrumental. This is also a characteristic of engagement by the states in the region as well. So policymakers in Ethiopia or Somalia or Sudan have been approaching their external relations instrumentally as well. And there's a long history of those states capturing external actors which are trying to achieve specific objectives in the region and turning those external engagements to their advantage. They would struggle with it at the moment, I think, because the key outside Eritrea or Djibouti, the key actors in the Horn at the moment are in flux. So all of the policymakers are struggling with competition domestically. Contrast with, say, 5 or 10 years ago, where in Sudan and Ethiopia anyway, the central states and the policy were more coherent. There's more competition, so they're not just dealing with the external agendas, but they have a long history and skills in instrumentalizing external engagement already. So if they have policy objectives, they will be able to turn these, knowing that external players don't have a coherent vision necessarily, especially the Gulf, but even Turkey's is not as coherent as it appears, can also help with that.
Wow, thank you. Charles, in a minute or two, please share with us your contribution from your study around promoting green economies in Africa, East Africa.
Yeah, thank you, Emmy, and thank you, delegates present. I'm Charles Tonri. I'm a research fellow at the African Center for Technology Studies and African Research and Impact Network co-convener. So we did actually embed the policy strategy into the study on the role of infrastructure in steering green economy in East Africa. And one of the key strategies is actually a multi-level policy engagement strategy. What we learned actually from the previous studies is that most of the lessons still remain in the shelves or remain in the experts' laptops, but not really transitioning to the policy discussion space. So some of the strategies actually that we used, and we are seeing some of the opportunity to harness the spin-offs, even though we have not maximized, is really engaging policymakers from the local to the regional level. And we got the opportunity, especially to engage with the Ministry of East Africa, whereby we were the first non-state actor to be permitted to be an observant in the negotiations for regional infrastructure. So it was a great opportunity to really appreciate research and really uptake by the government officials. We had also an opportunity to engage with the Parliamentary Committee on Environment in Kenya. And in fact, one of the key opportunities that normally parliamentarians raise is, why should you involve them when the project has already ended? Why don't you involve them at the inception phase? Mm-hmm. And one of the key opportunity also that we caught was really having our colleague, Dr. Chone Satela, co-leading actually the Africa AU Green Framework Development. So some of the lessons were really transitioned at the regional level. The question that you are asking ourselves right now is, how are we harnessing the spin-offs? Do you have the platform? Are we maybe measuring especially the spin-offs from the already funded EARF funded projects? And one of the platforms that you're trying to really capitalize on that is Africa Research and Impact Network. And I think it's an opportunity for FCDO and EARF to really look at what are some of the lessons that can really transition to not only the local policy space, but also high-level policy space. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Perfect. You've left us with some good questions. Thank you for sharing your contributions. As always with these things, there's not enough time, but I think we've managed to cover a lot of ground. We had some very good engagements. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Eric, for reflecting on this and sharing with us your reflections and your thoughts. The discussion is going on Twitter. As I'm informed, Stella had posted the handle. If you're more of a Twitter person and the conversation can continue online, please visit our website. We still have one session in the afternoon on COVID. Please join us again. Yes, if you still have some few minutes to go, we have a final video. Please do hang around. It's been my pleasure to be moderating and to be sharing this pieces of evidence with you. Thank you so much, and have a good rest of the day.